So we will continue today with Chapter 17, Nations and Empires. And our topic for today is technology and imperialism. So don't forget to jot down some notes and then send me a picture. All right, so industry, science, and technology. We've talked already about the first industrial revolution and how at the end of the 1700s, Great Britain experienced the industrial revolution, mainly in textiles. That was the main industry that was impacted by several new inventions, including the steam engine and other textile inventions that made it so that people could spin and weave cloth more quickly. So there's actually a second industrial revolution, that is what the IR stands for there, in the 1850s, and this obviously comes about 70 years after the first one starts. During the second industrial revolution, Japan actually becomes a world power, a major industrial power. We talked before about how Commodore Matthew Perry from the United States went to Japan and basically forced them to open themselves up to trade with the United States, which they did willingly. The U.S. was willing to use force if they did not do so willingly, but they did, and as a result, within like 40 years, Japan becomes a major, not even that, within a few years, Japan becomes a major world power. And then, by the 1930s, they're taking over China, taking over Korea, and moving forward to build a massive empire in the Pacific. Another key thing that happens during the Second Industrial Revolution is that the United States and Germany both surpass Great Britain in terms of industrial output. So if you were looking at like a pie chart of which country was producing the most industrial goods, the United States and Germany both surpassed Great Britain during this time. Okay, so steel production soared, and this allowed for sturdy buildings, including skyscrapers. And the cool thing about skyscrapers is that they allowed cities to build up instead of out. Because of the first industrial revolution, cities were growing rapidly, and immigrants were moving into cities so that they could find factory jobs, and there really was nowhere else for them to expand outward. And so steel production, allowing them to build sturdy skyscrapers, allows the city to build up. All right, another part of the second industrial revolution is the fact that you switch from textile production to the production of chemicals and oils and pharmaceuticals. And all of these become major industries that will become important even later in the First and Second World Wars. Another thing that alleviated the pressure of so many people being crowded into cities was automobiles and trolley systems. And both of those innovations alleviated congestion in large urban areas because, like I said, people flocked into cities so that they could find factory jobs. Electricity became widely used, and this is actually a cheap source of energy. And so before long, homes, factories, businesses were being lit up by electricity. So this was a switch from the oil lamp to the light bulb. Laboratories. This is where science and industry become interconnected because there were a group of German industrialists who started building research laboratories. If you're in AP Psych, we talked about in Unit 1 the fact that the first psychology lab was built in Leipzig, Germany by Wilhelm Wundt. And so the United States soon followed the German model for building laboratories, research facilities. Giant integrated firms emerged. In Europe and in the United States, there were limited liability joint stock companies that became the main source of capital for business activity. So we talked about joint stock companies with the exploration ventures and setting up colonies in the New World, but it's the same concept. A joint stock company is where you can invest in a company And then if the company goes under, it's like you're not liable for that company's debts or bankruptcy, because tons of people have put money into the industry, and really what you lose is your own investment, but you're not liable for the whole company's loss. And so the United States and Europe began to set up these joint stock companies that would allow people to invest in starting new businesses. And there was a lot of money to be made in that, as shareholders were no longer liable for the firm's debts. One great trade innovation was the Suez Canal, which is built through Egypt, and it connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. And so this significantly decreases travel time from those areas, and it makes it so people can go from the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean or to the Indian Ocean in, I guess, a speedier way. Telegraph cables improved communication. The cool thing about the telegraph was this allowed for instant communication. You no longer had to wait, 1 or 2 months for a letter to go from one side of the world to another. With telegraph cables, which eventually were put under the water as well, people could communicate instantly if they had access to a telegraph. So Charles Darwin became popular during this time. While traveling to Latin America, he he developed the theory of evolution, which was later written down in Origin of Species. With that, people who were super wealthy in the United States and Europe took Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest and applied it to society. And so social Darwinism is the idea that Europeans or white people are dominant because of survival of the fittest. They are the strongest race, and therefore they are surviving and reproducing. And because of survival of the fittest, they believe that they deserved this place in society. All right, so the age of imperialism. So between 1860 and 1900, European nations greatly expanded their territories. Most of what they were taking over was in Southeast Asia, in Africa, the Middle East, and the Caribbean. And European nations would set up colonies in those places and then force them to produce raw materials, or like if they found gold or silver, they would force them to mine that. Russia did this, the United States did this, Japan did this, but Europeans were mainly the ones doing this. So we've talked about this in several chapters already, but we know by now that the British took control of India, which became a consumer or a customer, a buyer of British manufactured goods, and a supplier of raw goods. And so the way this relationship worked was that the British took over India, India bought British goods, and India also provided cotton and other raw materials like tea or wheat or oil seeds to Great Britain so that those things could be manufactured or used in their factories. Obviously, the peasants are doing most of the production here, and they very rarely see, lots of income from that. So the Dutch controlled Indonesia. Holland actually sent the Dutch East India Company to rule Indonesia, first to take it over, but eventually they came to rule Indonesia in the same way that the British East India Company ruled India. But this came to an end in the 1830s, and the Dutch government took direct control over the colony. And that is a similarity with Great Britain as well. The British East India Company rule ended after the Sepoy Rebellion, and then the British took direct control. One of the things that they did was that they imposed heavy taxes in the form of labor. You may have heard of a tax in kind, but the way this worked was that everyone was forced to grow coffee on 1/3 of their land. And this coffee would be taken by the Dutch and sold. And of course, the Dutch would make a huge profit off of that. In the 1860s, they began to pursue the ethical policy instead. And the government loosened control a little bit in that they allowed more private enterprise. And they also encouraged Dutch people to go to Indonesia and settle there. Most of European colonization took place in Africa. This was called the Scramble for Africa. We've talked about before the Berlin Conference, which was held in 1884 and 1885, which was hosted by Prussian Prime Minister Otto von Bismarck. But basically, European powers, the United States, the Ottoman Empire, sat down and discussed how they would, quote, scramble for Africa, how they would basically take over all of Africa, which they almost did. And so the rule that they set up for this was effective occupation. And so effective occupation just means that in order to claim African territory, you have to actually live there. You have to send people there to settle the territory. One of the major problems that occurred as a result of this was that they completely ignored the boundaries that Africans had previously set up, which were tribal. They were based on what religions were practiced, what people group lived there, what language was spoken. And at the Berlin Conference, they really didn't consider that at all. They basically drew lines on the African map that decided what European power would take over what piece of African land. And this would create problems later on once these African colonies sought freedom, but their boundaries didn't match up with their tribes. And so this would come to cause a whole lot of conflict. All right, so looking at the motivations behind imperialism. So number one is wealth. It always boils down to money, and this is no exception. There was lots of money to be made off of extracting raw materials from Africa, and also through the trade market and having them purchase European goods. Adventure. King Leopold's ghost mentioned a guy named Henry Morton Stanley who was hired by Belgium to explore the Congo. Livingstone was another explorer who wrote all about the continent's economic potential, and in doing so created a good personal reputation for themselves. I don't know if it was good or not, but they created a reputation for themselves. Cecil Rhodes did this in South Africa. Karl Peters did this for Germany. And then lastly, they were always looking for converts. They wanted to convert the natives to Christianity. And I don't know if this, was an actual motive or this just justified their imperialism. But either way, many times they sent people, Catholic priests and such, to convert the natives to Christianity. So how did Africans feel about this? In most cases, they did not love being conquered by Europeans. And so in some instances, even though they became aware very quickly that the Europeans had superior weapons, many of them still attempted to resist European control, and they were entirely unsuccessful. There were cases like in West Africa, Samori Toure fought against the French using guerrilla warfare, and he held the French off for a long time, but ultimately was defeated. So in some cases, they kept the Europeans at bay for a little while, but basically, almost the entire continent was overtaken by Europeans. Some European administrators used brute force. The worst example of this was King Leopold I of Belgium. This is the guy they're talking about in King Leopold's Ghost. He took over the Congo as his personal colony and exploited the people for his personal gain. We talked about the fact that his administrators cut off arms and legs because people didn't meet certain quotas. And so this is obviously, horrible treatment of the people living in the Congo. So Europeans over time eventually were able to create stable bureaucracies. And once the Europeans um, let their colonies be free during the era of decolonization after World War II, many of those places eventually became nation states. And the boundaries that they used were basically the ones that were drawn up in the Berlin Conference. So the administrative goals here were, number one, for the colony to be able to pay for its own administration. So whatever Europeans set up to rule the colony would be paid for through taxes paid by the colonists. They also wanted to preserve peace. The colony can't be or cannot provide profit if there is not peace there, because people will be fighting instead of producing. And they also promoted economic growth. There was lots of wealth, lots of money to be made. And so Europeans, obviously, and I would say this would probably be the number one goal, was for them to make economic gains. So the new exports from this era of imperialism were cocoa, coffee, tea, and cotton. These were the most profitable exports that that the Africans provided for the Europeans. One side effect of this is that Africans' traditional way of life, the way that their families worked and their gender roles, all of that was disrupted as men went to work in mines and as women had to take care of the crops at home. And it actually disrupted like the African family life because of European colonization and what colonization required. And then the United States outward expansion occurred after the Spanish-American War. If you're in APUSH, we just talked about this, how the United States moves away from isolationism toward imperialism. And so the Spanish-American War, which was fought against Spain to help Cuba gain their independence, resulted in the United States winning Guam, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. And so the U.S. begins to move away from its isolationist policies toward imperialism, like the Europeans were doing. So after this, the United States kind of uses this as a precedent to begin intervening in the affairs of other Latin American countries. And the reason why is because they want to protect American property and investment. All right, that is all. We're going on 18 minutes. So y'all have a good day. Send me a picture of your notes.